Please advance the slide. One more time. One more time. All right, here's just a little bit of information about Quality Matters. And you can advance. All right, I'd like to talk about today's presenter. Welcome to Shimon Saraf. He is the Assistant Director for Survey Operations and Project Services at the National Survey of Student Engagement in Bloomington, Indiana. Shimon has worked with QM to set up an experimental set of questions on students' experiences with their online courses and has analyzed the results of the question set. This survey was given to students along with the NSSE survey in 2018. Please advance. All right, I wanted just to start out before having Shimon take it away with pointing out a little bit of information about QM research. When we talk about QM research, we are talking about research that supports the QM rubric and process. It's research that discusses its use and research that's also focused on its impact. Here I'm pointing out the QM Research Library, where we house research that supports the QM rubric and process. At this point, we have over 1,500 references in the library, and this library is continuously updated and can be accessed by anyone from the QM website. Please advance. All right, the other thing that I wanted to point out to you is the QM focused resources that we have on our website. This area has a listing of research on the use of QM and its impact. While a few of the studies that we have here go across a number of institutions, many are focused on the courses, students, and instructors at a single institution. And that kind of brings me to why QM has welcomed the chance to work with NSSE to pilot an experimental set of questions, because that set of questions went to a variety of institutions and allowed us to get some information that went cross-institutional. At this point in time, I would like to advance to the next slide and just show you how you can share on Twitter about something that you've learned today. So you can go to @QM Program, @NSSE Survey, and #HigherEd on Twitter and share a little bit. All right, next slide, please. Okay, at this point, I'm going to let Shimon take over and go through his presentation, and I'll join back up with you for questions at the end.
Thank you, Barbara. It is a pleasure to be able to talk with the QM community about our collaborative research project based on QM standards and how students experience them. So to start things off, let's review today's agenda. We'll start by reviewing the goals for the presentation and what we hope to accomplish, then say a few words about NSSE. We'll then review our 3 primary research questions, data sources used, and characteristics of the institutions and students being used in this study, followed by answers to the research questions and a few words summarizing the study findings and a few ideas for further investigation. There are 3 major goals for today's presentation. First, I'd like all of you to better understand how well college student experiences align with Quality Matters course design standards across a diverse group of students spread across 21 U.S. colleges and universities. Second, I hope to thoroughly explore with you the level of variation in student online learning experiences, Research studies of this kind often focus on the average student experience, but there is much to be learned from looking at the variation in results within any particular group. Lastly, in some small way, I hope these results will contribute to improving the learning experience for online students. After all, NSSE, the National Survey of Student Engagement, ultimately is about providing actionable information for colleges and universities to improve the college experience. A little bit of information about NSSE before we dive into the details of our research collaboration with Quality Matters. NSSE has been providing four-year colleges and universities information about their student experience in and outside of the classroom since 2000. Over 1,600 four-year colleges and universities have participated over the years, mostly here in the US and Canada. On an annual basis, we have approximately or between 500 to 750 institutions participate. NSSE's content reflects decades of student development theory and research. Its focus is on the frequency of certain curricular and co-curricular student behaviors, as well as student perceptions of the college environment. Both have been found to relate to desirable college outcomes like student retention and cognitive development. Schools use NSSE to inform institutional improvement efforts and discussions about why things are working well or not on any particular campus. Here are the three primary research questions I'll be answering today. The first asks about the extent of students experiencing QM-related standards for online learning and how results vary across different student groups. The second focuses on whether students at certain institutions are experiencing QM standards more than students at other institutions. Lastly, we explore the relationship between student satisfaction with their online learning experiences and activities related to QM standards. I used two data sources for answering these three research questions. The first is the core NSSE instrument that asks about students' background and demographic characteristics. I didn't use any NSSE engagement measures to answer these research questions, but if you'd like to get a gist of the survey's content, see the reference sheet about our 10 scales called engagement indicators. The URL is there within the first bullet. The second data source for this study are the experimental online learning experiences item set that Barbara talked about earlier. Every year, NSSE administers experimental questions for a variety of purposes, including to inform changes to our core survey questions, to explore a topic of public interest, or to investigate one or many more psychometric-related questions. See the item set at the URL listed in the second bullet. Both the core survey and experimental questions were administered together during the spring of 2018. Institutions were selected to administer the experimental items based on their substantial online learning population. Let's take a quick look at our sample characteristics. We had a diverse set of 21 schools administer the experimental questions after their students completed the core NSSE instrument. As I said, all had substantial online learning populations. The 21 schools had a median of 74% full-time enrollment, 61% female, 22% of students taking all courses online, 39% underrepresented minority students, and about 3,600 total undergraduate enrollment. 4 out of the 21 schools, which I call high online enrollment schools, had 50% or more of their NSSE 2018 respondents taking all courses online. At the student level, I analyzed approximately 5,000 respondents spread across the 21 institutions. Some of the institutions had a very large number of respondents, so in order to avoid any significant distortions in our results, we downweighted these particularly large schools, thus leaving a weighted sample size of about 3,500 students. This final sample included 76% seniors, the rest were first-year students. 68% were full-time students, 73% female, 70% adult learners, and 58% were taking all their courses entirely online during the spring term. I've listed some of the other characteristics that I had at my disposal for those who might be interested in some more details. So how did we identify online learners in order to administer the experimental questions? There are 2 consecutive questions on the core NSSE instrument that were useful for this purpose. The first question asked the respondent how many courses they were taking for credit during the current academic term. If they answered anything above 0 courses, one or more, a follow-up question asked how many were entirely online. Only students who reported taking 1 or more entirely online courses were able to answer the additional questions about their online learning experiences. So what did we ask students related to their online learning experiences? Take a look at the item set. You'll find the URL at the bottom of the page if you haven't already downloaded a copy. There were a total of 17 questions specifically related to the most important QM course design standards. For the purpose of this study, I divided them into 2 groups. The first I call effective course structure items, which included the first 12 items on the survey. Question number 1 and 2. The second group of items I call engaged online learning items and are found under the third group of items. There were a total of 5 items under that general area. On this slide, I've listed a few examples of both types of items. Note that the question stem and associated response options differ between the 2 groups of items. Effective course structure items use a "to what extent do your courses" approach, while the engaged online learning items use an "about how often have you done" approach when asking about students' experiences with these different standards. As we review results, keep in mind the values associated with the response options, ranging from 4 to 0 for course structure items and 4 to 1 for engaged learning items. All those response options you should see on the reference sheet provided. I'd like to point out 2 other questions from the experimental item set that are key to understanding the analytical sample I used for answering the research questions. Just to be sure we were truly getting respondents that were thinking about entirely online course experiences when completing the experimental questions, we asked the question on the left of the slide: how does the instruction for the online courses you were thinking about in the previous questions occur? 83% of the respondents responded with the first option, only taught online. The other 17% responded that courses they were thinking about did in fact have some level of in-person interaction. Only the 83% that said their courses were only taught online were included in the following analyses to answer the 3 research questions. To give you a sense of the type of entirely online courses this 83% took, the question on the right revealed that the vast majority of respondents, about 85%, reported that their courses had some level of asynchronicity. Only 15% reported their courses were fully synchronous. To make for a more compact and reliable analysis, I created 2 scales based on the 2 sets of items previously mentioned: effective course structure and engaged online learning. I created the scales by simply averaging responses to the 12 or 5 items. For example, if someone answered very much to all the course structure questions, they received a scale score of 4. Alternatively, if someone responded never to all 5 of the engaged online learning items, their associated scale score was 0. As you can see from the histogram off to the right, a large number of students scored a 4 on one or both of these 2 scales. 35% of course structure scores were at that high level, and 25% of engaged online learning scores were at that level as well, which I think is good news. Course structure scale scores range from 0 to 4, and engaged online learning scores range from 1 to 4. For the psychometricians in the audience, both scales appear to measure a single underlying construct based on several different types of statistical tests. And for those interested in multi-level modeling, only about 3% and 6% of the variation in these scores are at the institution level. You can see that under the column titled Intra-Class Correlation. This means these scale scores are not very dependent on the institution from which they came, but rather more dependent on the unique student characteristics. So let's talk about some of the results now. Here's the first research question. It asks about the extent of college online learning experiences aligning with QM standards and whether these results vary by student characteristics. Let's start by looking at the effective course structure questions to answer this question. Here are the 12 questions about course structure and a bar graph that reflects the percentage of students reporting that their online courses provided them very much or quite a bit within these 12 QM standard related areas. It is pretty clear that the vast majority of students indicate that their courses provide these things. At the top of the list, 88% say their courses provided a clearly stated grading policy and learning goals. At the bottom of the list, 75% said instructions for using technology were provided at a high level or reported very much or quite a bit. Again, this is good news overall, as only a small minority of students aren't experiencing these QM-related course design features. Now let's take a look at how effective online course scale scores vary or not by different student characteristics. In other words, are there any groups of students that appear to experience more effective online course structures than others? As I mentioned previously, using scales is a more reliable way to evaluate dimensions of quality matter standards like course structure. So that's what's being presented on this slide right now. To answer this question, I employ what is commonly known as a box and whiskers graph. A few words of explanation to ensure we're all on the same page in terms of our understanding. Each box shows the 75th percentile, that's the top of that blue box, along with the 25th percentile, and that's the bottom line of that blue box. The 50% of the scores between the top and the bottom of each box are considered part of the interquartile range. I'll refer to the interquartile range throughout the rest of the presentation. The vertical lines coming out of the top and bottom of such boxes represent some portion of the top 25% and bottom 25% of scores. In this case, the online course structure scale scores are so high you don't see any vertical bar emerging from the top of these boxes, but you will see it later on when we talk about some of the engaged online learning results. Importantly, the small dots at the bottom of the graphs represent individual student scores and are considered outliers of the distribution or somewhat rare. The red dots represent the 50th percentile score, or what I'm calling the median. The takeaway from these graphs is that for all student types, 75% of scores are at or above a 3, which is associated with the quite a bit response option of the individual questions. Some scores fall below a 2 or some, but not that many at all, which is good news. Once again, regardless of the student type, median scores are all near the top of the scale or very close to it. So for all practical purposes, there doesn't appear to be any group that is experiencing a meaningfully higher level of course structure, at least not among these 4 student characteristics. Let's compare how the students at the 4 high online enrollment schools talked about earlier compared to their peers at the 17 other schools. Recall that these schools had 50% or more of their NSSE respondents reporting all their courses were online. The distribution of scores at these 4 schools indicate a greater level of course structure being experienced. The median value for the group is about 3.8, while for the others, it is about 3.5. The interquartile range is pretty much centered between 3 and 4 points for both groups, so the vast majority of students are getting a very respectable level of course structure as part of their courses. Now let's see how scores distribute by academic major field for senior students. First-year students are excluded here because they are less likely to actually be taking courses within their intended major. For the most part, 75% of respondents, regardless of major, had a score of 3 or higher. Not much difference seen in terms of median, except by comparing the bottom and top majors, such as engineering and biological sciences, to social service professions majors, where there is a median difference of about a half point. Let's move on and look at the results for the engaged online learning questions and related scale. Results for the 5 engaged online learning questions show a good bit of variation in the percentage of respondents reporting very often and often, considerably more than the course structure questions. For example, 83% of students report frequently applying key information from assigned readings, but only 56% report frequently exchanging ideas, feedback, and questions with instructors. There's room for improvement with faculty and student interactions, as those 2 questions on the bottom show. But on other engagement front, the frequency of behaviors is already quite high in terms of beneficial activities suggested by QM standards. We can also review the distribution of engaged online learning scale scores by the same student background and demographic variables used for analyzing course structure scale scores. In contrast to the course structure results, we see considerably more difference between types of students. Seniors, part-time, minority, and female students all show noticeably higher median values by about 1/4 of a point. The interquartile range for their peers, such as first-year and non-minority students, dips deeply below 3 points. Now we look at engaged learning scores of students at high online enrollment schools. The low online enrollment schools' interquartile range stretches to the top of the scale, while the high group's 75th percentile is at about 3.5 points, with a median value about 1/4 of a point below where the low group is. If you recall from a few slides ago, this pattern was reversed with course structure scores. The students at high online enrollment schools had a higher median score relative to their peers. Looking across academic major field again, we see median scores at or slightly above 3 for the engaged online learning scale. The distribution of scores appears to vary more than course structure scores, with almost all institutions' interquartile ranges dipping below 3. Communications and social services professions majors show the highest median values once again, while biological science and other STEM fields show the lowest, along with business and engineering. Overall, there is more differences between schools in terms of engaged online learning scores compared to structure scores, but things still don't vary tremendously between institutions with this scale. Descriptive and graphical results like ones I just presented are informative, but using a statistical model can help isolate the independent relationship of any particular student characteristic with the two scales in question. On this slide, model results highlight positive, negative, and no relationships for a small handful of variables relative to both scales. Just take a moment to review these findings. I'll let them sink in for a moment. So, do these results make sense to you, given your experiences with online learners or literature you've read? Some consistent results across the two scales stuck out for me, namely the positive relationship for underrepresented minority students, the negative relationship for males, and no relationship found for first-generation students. Also notable was the powerful positive relationship of the effective course structure scale score while predicting engaged online learning scale scores. For the most part, I found very modest statistically significant differences between groups, amounting to about 0.15 points or less, quite small. Keep in mind that for each of these variables, except for effective course structure scores, the finding is in relation to some reference group. Take, for example, the positive relationship found between adult learners and effective course structure. It is a positive relationship because adult learners have statistically significant greater scores on average than traditional age learners, students that are 23 or younger, holding all other model variables constant. Alternatively, I could have used adult learners as the reference group and assessed traditional age learners more directly. Of course, the relationship would have been negative for traditional age learners. 7% and 41% of the variation was explained for structure and engagement scales, respectively, using the variables listed on the slide, plus variables to control for the effects of the various individual schools in this data set. The effective course structure score predicting engaged online learning was the real reason for the 41, the very high explained variance result of 41% for the engaged online learning scale. Now for the results for our second research question about institutional performance. Are there certain institutions that appear to do a better job aligning with QM standards, whether it be intentional or not? Here we see course structure scale score distributions by institution, sorted by each institution's median value. Keep in mind that the institution ID is something I created in order to keep the anonymity of all the schools, which is part of our agreement when they register for participating in NSSE. It is pretty clear that based on the median value, some institutions appear to be structuring their courses in ways more consistent with QM standards than others. Comparing the top and bottom schools, we see a very substantial difference in median value approaching 1 point. The good news from my perspective is that about 75% of students at most schools score at 2.8 or higher, just below someone reporting quite a bit for all structure questions. That still leaves about 25% of the students at each school distributing themselves somewhere between 1 and 2.8 on the course structure scale. Looking at the score distributions for the engaged online learning scale for the 21 schools, we do see some institutions based on their median values aligning with QM standards at a higher level than others. The difference between the top schools and the bottom schools is about a half point or more in terms of median value. The majority of schools in the middle, though, are only a quarter point different from one another. This graph also clearly shows that scores vary within schools quite significantly. Let's combine institutional average results from both scales to give us a different perspective on this question of whether some institutions appear to be aligning with QM standards at a higher level than others. This scatter plot of the 21 schools has the engaged online learning scale on the y-axis and the effective online course structure scale on the x-axis. We see a few things clearly using this graphing approach. First, all schools on average are scoring highly on both measures. And second, we see noticeable differences between the top and bottom schools, with the majority of schools clustered pretty closely together in the middle. Note that there is a very strong positive correlation between these two measures, with two institutions demonstrating that it isn't always the case. You can see them off to the sort of the left corner of that cluster and the right bottom corner of the cluster. How do these two online learning measures relate to outcomes? The one outcome-like measure we asked about on the survey was about the students' satisfaction with their online learning experiences. In this slide, I present a bar graph showing the percentage of respondents reporting their online learning experiences are excellent or good by 5 levels of course structure scale scores. The differences between each group is clearly substantial. 13% of the respondents experiencing the lowest levels of optimal course structure, or those that scored less than a 2 on the scale, report that their online experiences have been excellent or good. Compare this to the 98% of respondents at the top of the scale that report their experiences have been excellent or good. So to answer our research question, yes, satisfaction with the online learning experience does vary in a systematic way by level of course structure experienced. So how does satisfaction relate to engaged online learning scale scores? They definitely relate, as you can see from this graph, but the relationship is less pronounced compared with our course structure scores. 63% of the respondents experiencing the lowest levels of engaged online learning, or those that score less than a 2 on the scale, report that their online experiences have been excellent or good. Compare this to the 96% of respondents at the top of the scale that report their experiences have been excellent or good. One question for us all to ponder is, what does it mean when you can have extremely low engagement as measured in this study, but still have a good chance of being highly satisfied with your online learning experience? My guess, my educated guess, based on other student development research that I've read, is that it has to do with expectations. If students come to the online learning experience with low expectations as far as engagement, then they'll be less likely to be frustrated or disappointed if that doesn't occur. So let's quickly review what the data has told us today about our 3 research questions. First, student experiences with effective course structure generally appear aligned with QM standards, and there isn't much difference between different types of students. Engaged online learning scores vary considerably and are also high, generally speaking. We did find substantial differences in engaged learning by different student types based on descriptive statistics. Though results show high scores, some students don't experience a high level of structure or engagement. So those are populations that would be good to understand better in future research studies. In terms of comparing institutions, certain schools do appear better aligned with QM standards than others, but overall differences are not that great. The 21 schools we looked at appear to be doing well on average with effective course structure. There appears to be more room for improvement with engaged online learning experiences. So overall, these results are positive too. And like I said before, it may be that these students are at institutions or taking classes where high engagement in terms of the way QM measures it just isn't expected. Lastly, student satisfaction with the overall online learning experience appears to relate to both scales used in this study. For future research, I plan on doing more sophisticated statistical modeling in order to control for various background factors and get a more independent effect estimate for this research question. I think this presentation's research findings are a good start at understanding the student experience as they relate to the best practice with online learning course design. For the future, I plan to explore the comments students left in the open text box at the end of the survey, which should provide additional insights into this group of online students. For those from the college institutional research world, Barbara and I and a colleague of mine here at the Center for Post-Secondary Research, Jillian Kinsey, will be leading a group discussion about this research initiative at the annual conference of the Association for Institutional Research in Denver, Colorado in a couple weeks. If you happen to be attending, we hope you consider joining us again so we can hear about your experiences with online learners firsthand. So thanks for listening today, and I'm happy to answer any questions now or by email if we don't have time to cover everything by the end of the hour.
All right, thank you so much, Shimon. We do have a couple of questions, and I wanted you to answer them instead of me. I was afraid that I might misspeak. So the first question we have asks, were any of the institutions included in this experimental set of questions for-profit online institutions?
Yes, there were. to make a long story short, I can't say more in terms of who they are because of the issue of anonymity. But yes, there are.
Okay, thanks. Can you clarify if the survey was for undergraduate students only, or were graduate students included?
The survey was targeted at undergraduate students only. NSSE only administers the survey to undergraduates at four-year colleges and universities.
All right, thank you. And another person asked if these results are shared back to the institutions so that they can see where they might better align with QM and take action to get results.
NSSE doesn't typically send results back to institutions for the experimental items. If an institution is interested in their results, we will send them a data set so they can analyze the results on their own. In this case, I do plan on forwarding the recording of this webinar to all the participating institutions just to be sure that they have seen these results.
All right, somebody asked if any of the 21 schools in the study were members of QM, and would they have had some exposure to QM standards? And I'll answer that question. There were some of the schools in this experimental question set that are QM members. We don't know who they are. We're not sure how many of the schools were, but currently about 25% of higher ed institutions in the United States are QM members. So there is quite a bit of exposure to QM, whether or not schools are actually members. And then, of course, there's variation in the robustness of the implementation of QM at QM member schools. Somebody asked if attendees will receive a copy of the slides presented. Yes, in 1 week from today, we will be sending out a link to the recording of the webinar as well as a way to get the slides. Somebody asked if institutional results from nonprofits versus for-profits were analyzed.
They were not. They were not. That's a valid question. I did have some concerns because I did think about doing that, but I did have some concerns about how robust the findings were in terms of that, making that comparison.
Okay, let's see. Looks like some of the questions made it into the chat. So what % of the schools provided an intro to online learning experience for students overall?
Can you repeat that question, Barbara?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I've quite got this question. Let's see, somebody asked what % of the schools provided an intro to online learning experiences for students overall. That may be something that wasn't asked or that you wouldn't know if there was some type of an orientation to online learning or a class or some type of information that students had prior to taking their online courses. Would you happen to know that, Shimon?
I do not. I don't know that from the experimental items that were administered. So unfortunately, I can't speak to that.
Okay, let's see. Somebody asked, does the survey make clear to students the distinction between fully online and blended before they answer these questions?
Uh, yes, they do. On one of the slides that I showed you all, um, there was a question. It was a filtering question where we asked students about what they were thinking about, what sorts of courses they were thinking about when they responded to the previous questions, experimental questions about their online learning experiences. And so about 83% said that they were thinking about their entirely online courses, and they weren't thinking about their hybrid experiences per our request. And the 17% that did have some form of hybrid experience, in the end, for these research questions, were excluded. So we really we wanted to focus on students that were answering the questions in the way that we had intended, which was we wanted them to talk about their entirely online learning courses.
Okay, I'm not sure if this is a question you can answer or not, but somebody asked what percentage of the 21 institutions that participated are for-profit online schools?
I can, if the person that asked that question wants to email me, I'd be happy to tell them. I don't know that statistic off the top of my head. My
Oh,
apologies.
that's okay. We'll move along. Someone says, I understand that NSSE is looking at student satisfaction, but do you also look at course outcomes as compared to their face-to-face counterparts?
NSSE over time has done a lot of or several studies looking at the differences between online learners and face-to-face learners. So there's quite a bit of research in that area. We have found that online learners' engagement in their curricular and co-curricular activities are at an equal or even a greater level than the face-to-face learners, and that's been pretty consistent. There's two areas where online learners don't seem to be experiencing engagement at very high levels relative to the face-to-face learners, and that's collaborative learning and student-faculty interaction. And yeah, so that's what I can say about our comparisons with face-to-face learners. In terms of the outcomes at our disposal, I think that was the primary gist of this question. We don't have that many outcomes. We have a set of questions about students' self-reported gains in various areas. There's about 8 to 10 questions about their beliefs and how they perceive their development in critical thinking and quantitative reasoning and a variety of things. So sometimes that's used as a type of outcome, and there's questions about satisfaction. There are about 2 or 3 questions that could be construed as measuring the satisfaction with their college experience, but we don't have other outcomes sort of embedded within the survey. We have collaborated with institutions over time who provide us the GPA of students. Sometimes I think we've even had access to graduation results, but primarily it's been retention from the first to the third semester. Who's actually been retained among the first year students, and what are students' GPAs? And we've correlated that with engagement measures. I hope that answers your question.
All right, let's see. Somebody says, in reference to the current question, I offer a course in both traditional and online modes. Okay, this looks like mainly a comment. Let's see. All right, there's a few more questions I think that just came in. Someone asks, I want to take your research results to improve student experience. The takeaway that I see is that course structure and its use-friendly navigation of accessible material and assessments, etc. Is there another application-oriented finding that you recommend?
Well, I think all of the course structure questions tap into important dimensions of a quality online experience in terms of the one outcome that we had to base that claim on is satisfaction, where we saw the course structure questions in a combined way. They all really did seem to matter to student satisfaction. So the one slide that I presented with those 12 questions related to the structure of courses, they all showed students to be very highly engaged in those sorts of areas with their courses. So I think they're probably all very good in terms of picking out particular practices. I'd have to look at some of the more detailed results, but I think that's a valid question. If that person wants to contact me, I can actually tell you which of those structure dimensions of structure are related to higher satisfaction than others, which, given more time, I probably would have pursued with the presentation, but decided to leave out. But in terms of practical findings, I think I might be able to send this individual who asked the question a little more pointed advice.
Okay, we have somebody ask, how was QM alignment defined before the study? For example, were all students taking courses that were developed to QM standards? And I'll answer that question. Basically, the experimental question set was aligned with the QM standards, with the QM rubric. It doesn't represent the whole QM rubric, but it's a select number of questions based on a select few of the standards from the QM rubric. And essentially what we wanted to find out with the study was what were students actually experiencing, and was what their online experience was that aligned with what we talk about with the QM rubric and the QM standards. So we were just trying to see what their experience actually was. All right, well, let's see. There may be one more question. No? Looks like that's all of the questions that we have. So if you want to advance a slide. Okay, I would just like to thank everybody for attending today and mention that QM Connect is going to be in Grapevine, Texas, October 27th through 30th. So we would love it if you would join us there. And then one more thing to mention to you. At this point, we can have the recording end.